get to the bottom of what's truly healthy in this crazy, complex world, so you can take back what is rightfully yours. Welcome to the Health Sovereign Podcast. This is your host, Logan Christopher.
Got another Medical Monopoly Musings episode for you today. Here we dive into how Big Pharma spends money advertising, specifically on television, and how this in turn affects news media, what they cover, and some other related aspects to that, how they can actually control coverage to some degree. Medical Monopoly Musings number 48, Direct-to-Consumer Pharmaceutical Advertising. Direct-to-consumer, DTC, pharmaceutical ads are only allowed in 2 countries across the world, the USA and New Zealand. The FDA relaxed rules in 1980 for DTC pharma ads. Then in 1997, the FDA lessened regulations for the industry even more. It is here that we saw these ads become widely prevalent in the US. In 2015, Big Pharma spent $5.4 billion in DTC ads. The major TV networks CBS, ABC, NBC, and Fox received most of this. At the top of the list was CBS with $511 million. Make no mistake, DTC ads are only a small portion of their marketing budget. We'll cover the other marketing aspects in future issues. Here's some of the top drugs advertised in 2015 by ad spend. Humira, $357 million. Lyrica, $328 million. Eliquis, $249 million. Cialis, $222 million. A common myth spouted by the drug companies is that they must charge so much money to fund research costs. The truth is most of the drug research starts from publicly funded science. Furthermore, they're one of the most profitable industries, and they spend significantly more on sales and marketing than on R&D. A spokeswoman for the industry trade group Pharma said, providing scientifically accurate information to patients so that they are better informed about their healthcare and treatment options is the goal of direct-to-consumer pharmaceutical advertising about prescription medicines. Beyond increasing patient awareness of disease and available treatments, DTC advertising has been found to increase awareness of the benefits and risks of new medicines and encourage appropriate use of medicines. The industry says that these ads are for educating the public. To this, Diane Zuckerman, president of the National Center for Health Research, said, "If the real goal is to educate, they wouldn't look like this. The goal is to persuade. These ads educate people as much as the ads for Gap or ads for makeup educate. It is educating you to tell you that this product exists and that it's great." So do the ads work? A 2011 report by the Congressional Budget Office found that drugs with DTC ads had 9 times more prescriptions than those that did not. Yes, these ads are driving customers. In a study looking at this, Frosch et al. Found that this advertising has some benefits, but significant risks are evident as well. The advertising leads to a variety of outcomes. Even the American Medical Association wants to stop DTC advertising, changing their position in 2015. According to Jerry Avorn of the New York Times, DTC advertising promotes only the most expensive products. It drives prescription costs up and also encourages the medicalization of American life, the sense that pills are needed for most everyday problems that people notice, and many that they don't. As you can imagine, the scientific complexity of a drug is hard to cover in a 1-minute commercial. In 2002, AstraZeneca came under fire for the drug tamoxifen for overstating the benefits and understating the risks. The FDA didn't respond to the ad for 6 months. The FDA regulations are drafted and enforced in such a way that encourages drug companies to cross the line, with a lack of resources to identify violations and enforcing these regulations, said Barbara Brenner, Executive Director of Breast Cancer Action. They do not have the resources to monitor drug ads prior to publication, so the burden of monitoring these ads then falls on the public. And there is one other big benefit to drug companies that this advertising buys. We'll dive into that the next issue. Medical Monopoly Musings number 49, Advertising and Harassment Influence News Programs. Last time we covered how direct-to-consumer advertising influences consumers into using more pharmaceutical drugs. This is one in many steps that have led to increased medicalization. In 2015, we saw $5.4 billion in spend on TV ads. The rates of these ads are ever increasing. The first half of 2018 saw a 6% increase in TV ad spend, in large part aided by Big Pharma, which increased its ad budget by 17%. It is possible it is close to $10 billion in 2020. With TV, ads are marketing to the elderly population, which are the people that are still watching, as opposed to younger generations, which get their media online, where advertising is also increasing. But the advertising spend is just one piece in a full court press in order to influence news programs. Award-winning investigative journalist Sharyl Attkisson shares details of what she calls pushback from corporate interest while she worked at CBS. In her book Stonewalled, she details many such examples, as Florida Explorer rollovers with Firestone tires. She also talks about pharmaceutical companies. Resisting the pushback on a news report about drug safety, we air the story as planned, and executive producer Jim Murphy asked for more. We continue digging into FDA-approved prescription drugs that are allegedly proving problematic from a safety standpoint. When we do, hired guns for pharmaceutical interest flood me and CBS News with emails, phone calls, and requests for meetings. They write letters to CBS attorneys. The spokesman for the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Tommy Thompson, calls the CBS News Washington bureau chief to exert pressure to discredit our stories. Pharmaceutical company lawyers set up secretive meetings with CBS officials in New York. Pharmaceutical interest contact CBS executives to complain. At one point, when I'm covering safety concerns about the highly profitable cholesterol drugs known as statins, whose makers buy advertising on CBS, Murphy receives what he views as a harsh threat from one of the CBS sales bosses. The manager leaves Murphy a loud, angry voicemail saying that the stories could really harm business. My producer and I are also receiving direct pressure from news executives in New York who begin unnaturally inserting themselves into the news gathering and approval process for the pharmaceutical-related stories, as they have never done with me before. Even after our scripts go through the normal editorial process and receive approval from the legal department, the executives enter to dissect and question each fact and sentence. An executive confesses to me in frustration that she's been given a mission of trying to stop my stories. Notice that there are several tactics used by the pharmaceutical interests here. Advertising and the threat of pulling ads is just one tool of many. Others include legal action, political allies, harassment, and more. In other sections, she also mentions pushback from industry front groups or AstroTurf organizations. It was problems like these that caused Sharyl to leave CBS and become independent. The reason I follow her work is that she is actually a great journalist that does not succumb to these pressures. She's now labeled a right-wing conspiracy theorist by detractors, of course, despite the above stories occurring during the Bush administration. Next time, we'll dive into the power of an interlocking directorate, which may be the biggest reason that mainstream journalism is as broken as it is today. It's really not often the journalists themselves, but the managerial and executive layers where we need to look. So I believe I mentioned this previously, but my goal is really to understand how a narrative is controlled or influenced, all the different aspects and pieces that allow that to happen. So in the previous medical monopoly episode, we talked about Wikipedia in there, and some of the details about that came from the same lady mentioned here, Sharyl Attkisson, who, as I said, love her as a journalist. I have dug deep into her work, read her books, really helped me to understand how the news media, the mainstream media, is being manipulated. And I do find it hilarious, expected really, that how she is called by her detractors right-wing conspiracy theorists because of the stuff she covers, right? That is a common term that is thrown around just to knock someone out of the conversation, dismiss them, rather than actually look at the evidence they're bringing to light. And this largely, although the cases we're talking about there did happen back during the Bush administration, and she's an award-winning journalist, who worked many different years in different administrations. She covered corruption during the Bush administration. She covered corruption during the Obama administration. And actually that was where the journalism got much worse during that, is one of the things she talks about in her book. So that's why I like her work, because I found her to be quite credible in pushing back against all this pushback. So my goal is to understand how all these pieces fit together. So how is it actually done? Because I've gotten into conversation with people that just cannot believe that medical authorities could be so corrupt despite all the evidence. And it doesn't help to just wave evidence in their faces, and I guess these would be examples of it, but I'm really trying to get to how this is done. What are the pieces that allow this to occur so that we can actually perceive, and then, where can things be corrected? So we need to understand the details of how the propaganda machine works. So Wikipedia is a piece of that. Of course, mainstream journalism, the main news channels are such a huge piece, and we see it's not one thing. It's not just the advertising. That's important. And previously I thought that the advertising was a bigger part of that influence. It certainly is a part. I was surprised to find that they had done studies and found that drove customers itself. Personally, just seeing those pharmaceutical ads did not make me want to go to a doctor and ask about them at all, but I'd already sidestepped the standard Western model. So other people, they see that, they ask their doctor about it, they get a prescription. So they do work in that way. But I have to think that even if they did not drive customers at all, it would be a worthwhile expenditure, just because how that gives the pharmaceutical interests. And once again, realize this happens with all sorts of other corporations as well, not just Big Pharma, but how that influences the news media programs, because, as we saw there, threats that they're going to pull out their ads because of such stories. But that's only one aspect to it, and it's really the higher up. In the next episode with Medical Monopoly, we're talking about interlocking directorates, and that's a fascinating piece. I'd known about this behavior, but that term, I feel that term is as important as like revolving door or captured agency, something you need to understand, or tobacco science, what these things mean. And when you can understand these, you get the picture of what is happening. So that's a good one coming up. But it's all these different tactics that allow for control, allow for influence, and allow things to get worse over time. And that's why we find ourselves in this position in 2020. If you go back, say, 40 years, look at the coverage of corporations, pharmaceutical interest, much more. Dare I say, even vaccines. You can find what actually looks like real good journalism around the topic if you go back in time. Nowadays, no. And that is something also that Attkisson came up against around the coverage of the vaccines as well. So once again, I feel it's important to understand how this is being done, and there's a lot more to investigate because it is a full court press. There are so many pieces that allow this huge machine, the profit-making machine that is Big Pharma, to continue to push its agenda despite all the cracks in it, despite the obvious flaws. Once you actually are outside of their viewpoint, you can see it's just so obvious. But they have so much money, so much power to continue to do this, and it crosses all channels. It's not just advertising, right? It is the influence of news. It is the public relations or propaganda. It is the influence of politicians. It is their connection to financial institutions as well, and how all that plays together. And it's really hard because it is so complex. But I feel we must understand these pieces. That's why I'm diving in. If you enjoyed this, head on over to healthsovereign.com, leave a comment, share this with other people, leave a review, however you like to do it. Much appreciated either way. Thanks for listening.